Hey there, folks. This is Garrett Dawn with Command Z, and we're here tonight with a very special podcast with a very special guest that I'm honored to have tonight, who is Mr. Antero Alli. And here at Command Z, it is my goal to highlight and share the work of people who advocate the use of the body, the awareness of the body, and individual awareness as central to consciousness exploration. Because often there's a huge disconnect for people between what they study and explore and then their body and their daily life. So Antero is the reclusive author of 8 books, an astrologist, an underground filmmaker. He's also the founder and director of the fascinating Paratheatrical Research, which is an active resource for group paratheater work in Berkeley, California, and a world-renowned authority on the 8-circuit brain model as first developed by Timothy Leary, who endorsed Ali's first book, Angel Tech. Once a year, Antero conducts an 8-week online course on the 8 circuits, and incidentally, the next one starts on March 15th. For more information on that work and that course, go to verticalpool.com and also paratheatrical.com. And I'll also direct you guys to the links that you found just above where you found this file or where you are listening to this audio right now. So without any further introduction, I'd like to welcome you, Antero, to the show. And again, I'm honored to have you here.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Great. So from talking with you and reading about your work with the 8-circuit brain model and the Paratheatrical Research Group, it's obvious that the body remains powerfully engaged in your work on consciousness exploration. And I think that sets you apart from many other so-called consciousness pioneers in that the body seems to be directly involved in all of the work that you are putting out there and then in your own explorations. So let's go into the discussion with that in mind.
That sounds good. Timothy Leary, who first developed his model of the 8-circuit brain back in the 60s, he used to be called, he had a nickname at Harvard called Theory Leary. And partly because he produced reams and reams of theories. And when I first came upon his book, it was called Exopsychology at first and then Infopsychology later on, where he outlined the 8-circuit process. I thought, well, what a really brilliant book, but I can't really see how, in the way he describes it, how it might be able to be applied in somatic or physical or daily experience. It seemed more abstract to me. And that was, that knowledge, that kind of insight right there just spurred me on to thinking, well, maybe I can present my version of this 8-circuit model and gear it more towards the embodiment of the consciousness that's symbolized by the 8 circuits. And that's where the inspiration for writing my first book, Angel Tech, came from.
Yeah, that is wonderful. And incidentally, I recall reading that book a long time ago. And at the time, I was very fascinated with some of the concepts, particularly no form, which we'll get into a little more tonight, hopefully. But at that time, I hadn't gone through any kind of body transformation. And that was one of the first books that sort of slapped me down and forced me to understand some of those theories from a physical perspective and also integrating them into my daily life. And then, of course, looking at your book, The 8-Circuit Brain, even more so, the exercises and the awareness that's promoted and offered in there definitely relate directly to the body and into one's actual experience rather than something that's sort of a hobby or a mental experiment on the side, even though it does have some cognitive and mental components.
One anecdote with the second book, The 8-Circuit Brain, subtitled Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body. It came out in 2009, and it was never a book that I ever wanted to do. After writing Angel Tech, I thought I was just done with the 8-circuit model. I didn't know what else, I could really, present on it. But after 25 or 30 years passed after writing Angel Tech, I realized in returning to the 8-circuit brain system that I began to discover new connections within the grid that I had not written about. And also I was compelled, turning 60, feeling like an old geezer, that it was time for me to maybe give back to the community, but specifically to the community of the generation younger or even younger than the younger one, like those coming into their 20s and 30s at this time. So my motivation for writing the Eighth Circuit Brain was primarily not for myself, whereas Angel Tech, I actually wrote that for myself. It was not meant to be published. I never wrote it in order to, have it go out, and be read by tens of thousands of people or whatever. But this one, definitely I wanted to get out there into the hands of, the younger generation.
Right, and from what I can tell, it's very much appreciated. And as you discussed, I think it brings the Eighth Circuit model down into the hands of people who really can benefit from working with it. And it actually is a nice way to ground out some of the consciousness exploration and expansion. And actually, that's one of the things that fascinated me about looking at your brief write-up about the 8 circuits on your website, even the connection between each of those circuits, the survival, the physical survival circuits versus the so-called higher 4 circuits, and the connection between those two, which was something I had either neglected to notice or didn't fully integrate the first time around in my experience with those, with that model.
Yeah, I found that, putting the circuits aside, because the circuits in and of themselves, they basically refer to like a symbolic way of organizing or ordering essentially chaotic experience in the body and even out of the body. And what I discovered was that the bottom 4 circuits, which represent physical, emotional, conceptual, and social survival, tend to act or can act as anchors to help stabilize and integrate the shocks linking to the upper circuits of somatic, psychic, mythopoetic, and quantum intelligence. And I came to discover 4 very distinct types of shock that come along with experiences that this particular model might call somatic or psychic or mythopoetic or quantum intelligence. For example, I'm seeing that a shock that almost anybody these days is really familiar with that's the shock of ecstasy. Not necessarily the drug, although that can trigger ecstasy too. But any kind of full-bodied experience of rapture and the ecstatic expression of joy in a kind of a very here now place, in its own way, is a bit of a shock to the previous 4 circuits. Can kind of blow your mind a bit. It can rub against the grain of our, conditioned moralities. It can mess with our sense of territory and boundaries, when we're in a state of ecstatic rapture. So that's why I call it the shock of ecstasy, as a 5th circuit shock. And the 6th circuit, the psychic or neuroelectric circuit, I found that links to shocks of escalating uncertainty, those times and places where, let's say, we're between jobs or we're between houses, or maybe we've, been evicted, or we're between relationships, and all of a sudden there's this huge, massive gap opening up, and we enter an escalating state of uncertainty. So it's a bit of a shock then. People can go into these kind of numb places when their nervous systems basically reach, the limit of how much uncertainty they can permit. Also, the shock of uncertainty can also act as a highly creative state. As an artist myself and the artists I work with, we all know that, improvisation and the creative process depends on, the comfort that we can show and not knowing what the hell is going to happen next. And this, going along with that flow. And the mythopoetic 7th circuit correlates to the shock of unity or indivisibility, those moments where, you come into some experience and, there is no division between you and anything else. And there's this kind of overarching, overriding sense of just being at one with everything, and the ego is completely obliterated at that point, and you're seeing yourself in the eyes of others, And whenever you're condemning one person, you're actually condemning yourself. You make someone else happy. You make yourself happy. So there's no division. So this is the shock of indivisibility that comes to us through the Seventh Circuit. And the Eighth Circuit shock links us with the experiences of impermanence. We come into those moments of, great loss in our lives where, we were under the spell or the trance of things lasting forever, or, things staying the way they should stay. And all of a sudden, the rug is pulled up from beneath you, and, things are not so permanent after all. And that can be a bit of a shock, too. And I found that these upper circuit shocks can be stabilized and integrated by lower circuit work, meaning the work it takes to integrate physical, emotional, conceptual, and social intelligence. So I'm kind of went on a rant there, but that's the basic part of the interconnectedness that I discovered, and why I wrote The Eighth Circuit Brain, the new book.
I think that interconnectedness is exquisitely beautiful, and that's something I didn't even notice in Wilson's take on it.
No.
And he writes really nicely about it. But the way you just described that, let's visit one of the specific examples, Circuit 6 and Circuit 2. So we have, and I also saw you mention Circuit 2, for example, relates to the will to power.
Yeah.
Now, instantly, I had the thought that, okay, in these situations of uncertainty, like you mentioned, between homes, between relationships, between jobs, that then, like you said, people can become numb. Now, let's say the will to power has become integrated in some sense. Then each time those shocks of the in-between space arise, suddenly if the will to power is activated enough or integrated enough, at least from what I'm understanding, those become very rich and powerful experiences.
Absolutely.
Rather than devastating or destabilizing, they could actually be more stabilizing and provide opportunities that could not be found otherwise without the shock.
That's exactly right. Oftentimes, especially with Circuit 6 shock of uncertainty, if the Second Circuit, if the emotional intelligence and the will to power is not, realized or active, it's very common people are left with feelings of powerlessness and helplessness, and that sort of makes things worse in a way. And so, you can stay in a state of uncertainty only for so long before it transforms into anxiety. And anxiety is to me a word to refer to people, the kind of state of nervous energy people enter when their nervous systems reach the limit of how much uncertainty they can permit before becoming nervous monkeys.
Yeah.
And with the Second Circuit integration, when the will to power is activated, basically, the wonderful thing there is that it helps you permit more uncertainty, basically, and allows you to endure greater stretches of uncertainty and even work with the force of uncertainty as a creative process.
Yeah, and it seems that uncertainty also has the power to reveal the malleability of things, which then you can see how to change or improve or transform your current situation in a way that's healthy and beneficial to you.
That's exactly right. What you just described there is one of the functions of the Sixth Circuit, and that is metaprogramming.
Ah, beautiful. Yeah, so the model makes perfect sense. It makes sense.
Reprogramming your own nervous system through entering heightened states of uncertainty.
Yeah, so that makes perfect sense, and so that's what, as I was rereading just the brief descriptions of these, that brought all the 8 circuits home in such a real and tangible way that I had never really witnessed before. Just reading about them just to prepare for the talk here, and it struck me as exquisite how they all seem to fit together in that way. It felt like an upgrade of my understanding of the whole system.
Yeah, it's fucking elegant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. So it's awesome that you were able to make that connection, and then from there put together the book where you can start to explore and integrate and develop those experiences in a more deliberate way, rather than perceive yourself, as a victim of them as you start to experience consciousness expansion.
Well, like I said, it took a lot of years of just living life to get away from the eighth circuit brain as some kind of intellectual, model, and just live my life. And the state of uncertainty or the state of impermanence or ecstasy, they have nothing to do with symbols or circuits or anything. Those are real energetic states that people, get into and endure or flip out around. What the eighth circuit brain model can do is simply a kind of a diagnostic medium where you can use it to identify and organize certain experiences to better, let's say, navigate those experiences and work with them rather than become victimized by them.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I think that's ultimately a great goal or a foundation for any kind of research or exploration into consciousness and consciousness expansion is in order to always be aware of when you might be slipping into a victim sort of state, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
a victim of
Mm-hmm.
external circumstances or internal feelings or ideas about yourself and whatnot. So having
Right, right.
a tool set like this is
Yeah, the
much.
self-victimizing, self-stabbing syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. And that's very easy to fall into and sometimes difficult to see outside of. So that's another piece of beauty about this model is that it just gives you some very specific ways to understand what's going on, but none of them lead back to that self victimization,
Mm-hmm.
which it just gives you something to work on. You say, okay, well, obviously this shock that I've had happen is similar to this, which relates to this, let's say, circuit number 3. So if I can focus on the will to reason and rationality and try to understand things in this way and integrate my experiences in that particular way, then you'll get instant results with some stability and
Well,
some
that's very
anchoring.
interesting. Interesting you bring up the connection between circuit 3 and 7, because in the shock of indivisibility, when the intellect is faced with this all-encompassing unity, see, the intellect is what gets shocked. The intellect functions through duality. It really requires association and comparison to function. And when you enter an experience where all of that duality would enter basically a non-dual experience, the intellect doesn't know what to do. It's basically put on stun. It's just stunned. And at that point, it can be the intellect can fall one way or the other. In a sense, it can kind of flip out and go crazy and frenetic and trying to figure out what is really not going to be figured out, because non-dual experience is not going to be figured out by a dualistic intellect. This just doesn't work that way. So it'll either freak out and kind of go into a frenetic chasing its tail mode, which is kind of like a crazy making activity that we all know about, or it can humble down and say, okay, I'm basically part of something much bigger than me, and I don't know what the fuck it is, so I'm going to pay attention and see what I can learn. And so if the intellect has the capacity for humility, then basically you don't really need to humiliate yourself so much. And so there's this choice between humiliation and humility. There's a very important intellectual choice. And then the intellect can begin developing a language, oftentimes leaning more towards a poetic rather than a rational expression of words and thinking and languaging, so that perhaps the entire relationship to words and putting words together and language transforms. This is something that I learned. I had a medical emergency, a kind of a mini stroke experience where I lost the use of language as I knew it. This was long ago, about 25 years ago. And I had to completely review my relation to words and how I wrote and how I spoke and how I thought. And it took a couple of years to kind of get back to a place where I could actually start communicating to other people what it is that I saw, felt, and experienced. But it was, at that point, much different than anything I had known before. And the main difference was that I was done using words to simply explain stuff, and it became more important for me to find ways of arranging words to trigger the experience of the energy of the state I was in, not just for myself, but for other people. And so this informed my writing style, and the way in which I maybe script, dialogue for my films, and just sometimes just the way I speak, with people in daily conversation. I'm more uncomfortable explaining myself. I'd rather, if I could, find ways to, trigger the experience of the energy I'm experiencing in you.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, it brought to mind there's actually an exercise by the old one of the old teachers, Vernon Howard, that
Mm-hmm.
was where you resist the urge to explain yourself to anyone and ultimately to yourself as well. And such a simple seeming exercise, but it seems
Well,
to
I
be
learned
sort
a
of.
lot from Bob Wilson, Robert Anton Wilson, and I got to know him a bit back in the early '80s, and inspired quite a bit by his writing. And he told me one day that one of the old English words for magic was gramarye, and that the of spell casting, of arranging words and spells, which are invocations, as a means to trigger or incite, particular energetic effects, beyond yourself.
Right, right. I recall some of his discussions about that as well, and I know the well-known Golden Dawn text kind of begins with that assertion, and then seemingly most folks who end up studying it lose track of that. But that's the basis of the entire study. Was how language and words and expressions.
Easier said than done, but people can experiment with this right away by minimizing the use of the word is.
Aha. Now, I knew that was going to come up in this discussion at some point, and I felt glad about that. And as I put together my notes for it, I noticed just from knowing that you and I both have some experience with that I would have the pressure of expressing these points without the use of the to be verb. And
Challenging,
instantly, yeah, challenging, but always valuable.
evocative.
Definitely evocative, yes, and that seems to it does relate to a sort of more poetic sense of expression. I recall doing that with my college papers, and suddenly the grades went up very easily, but none of the professors really recognized why or what
Yeah.
was going on in the writing. But it felt like an almost effortless way to improve writing, focusing on
Well,
that one point.
I found by minimizing the is word, um, developing a way of speaking, writing, thinking, languaging, that it became, in a sense, more friendly towards my more non-dual experiences, more of the what I call the seventh mythopoetic states of consciousness, which are not, those states of consciousness don't seem to be very is friendly. They tend to synchronize and work better with ways of thinking and languaging and writing that minimizes the demonology of is.
Ah, yes. I notice there is a sense of laziness that I will indulge in when, well, once we've talked about it, and hopefully people listening, once they've listened to it and let that sink in, they may notice that the is word stands out more than it used to in their awareness. Certainly
Yeah.
that works, that happens to me. And then in particular, like I said, preparing notes like this, but it makes me want to go back and look at all the things that I've put up online and other places and see if I can't make those a little bit more clear by removing those to be verbs.
Well, I think one easy way of demonstrating how the is word works is that in any given paper that you're writing or anything that you're talking about, simply replace the word is with the mathematical symbol for equals, equal sign. And you will begin to see a pattern of formulaic thinking. And when you are using the is word consistently, what happens is that you're creating a series of formulas. This equals that. This is that. This equals that. Formula on formula on formula. And eventually, your whole thinking process becomes formulaic. There's nothing especially wrong with that, except that it tends towards more mechanical thinking rather than creative thinking.
Yes, I can see that right away, and that's a wonderful practice that definitely I will write up and put alongside this recording. I think that's a fun little exercise that if people get nothing else from listening to this, they can give that a try and see how far they can go.
So let's leave this fucking is word behind and move on.
Exactly. So one thing I wanted to talk about, and if we end up back at the 8 circuits, that's fine. If not, that's also fine. But I also was really fascinated this time around by your paratheatre work, and I think it relates pretty clearly to some of the 8 circuit work. At the very least, obviously, both are informed by each other since you spent a lot of time on both of those. One of the jumping off points I found very interesting was you wrote that you view the physical body as the embodiment of the subconscious mind. So let's expand on that, because it's very related to the work that I do, and also I think to the interests of the listeners to this type of an audio as well. So the physical body as the embodiment of the subconscious mind.
Yeah. Well, one of my early inspirations is an early 20th century kind of genius poet named Antonin Artaud. And he, in his book of The Theater and Its Double, wrote on the organs in the body really representing the vital currents by which the actor, the performer, draws upon the energy from the body itself without realizing that this is where the energy is coming from. And in my 30-plus years of doing the paratheatre process, which is a very vigorous physical discipline, we've discovered how the energies that we're tapping and resourcing all come from the body. Now, what I mean by the body being an embodiment of the subconscious mind, 99% of what happens in the body remains out of sight to the conscious mind. All the organs that are working, the nervous system, the skeletal system, it's all invisible to the conscious mind. And so this is part of what I'm talking about, the body embodying the subconscious mind. And so when we work in the paratheatre process in these physically rigorous processes that bring us to feeling the body deeply, feeling the body very deeply, which is an ongoing practice in what we do, it unleashes the forces trapped in the organs or trapped in the muscles. These forces could be memories, they could be emotions, they could be spirits trapped in our muscles, in our cells, in our organs, and they become unleashed, and then we give them physical expression, vocal expression, expression through spontaneous convulsive movement, symbolic gesture, and sometimes characterizations and stories ooze out of the body in this paratheatrical process, which, by the way, is primarily non-performance oriented. There's no audience, there watching. It's a private process, almost entirely. Over the last 30 years or so, maybe 80% of everything we've done has been private. And, maybe once every 5 or 6 years, I'll invite the public in to witness something of what we're doing, or we'll develop some kind of performance vehicle based on our more recent research.
Right. That was something that really stood out to me about it was the asocial component. And I want to get to that in specific, but first to give people just a little bit of background. I wanted to just mention what you had written as the overall aims of the work. So I'll just read those three
Okay.
aims and then we can kind of dive in from there, just so people have a little bit to hang on to while we go into it. Because it's a really fascinating body of work, and I think there might be more than a few people listening who may be interested in pursuing it a little further, or at least studying it and getting into it a little bit more. So, the overall aims of the work, as you wrote, are to expand access to the internal landscape towards its full-bodied expression, to increase flexibility of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies, and to interact with others from a place of heightened autonomy and integrity. Okay, so then in terms of those aims, I really enjoyed your concept you called the archaeology or an archaeology of the soul, which you referred to as an excavation process for making the unconscious conscious. Now, we just talked a little bit about that already. Can you share some real life examples that you've witnessed or that come to mind in your own life or just in that you've observed to highlight that process?
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. The book that was published in 2003, like 11 years ago now, that contains about 25 years of, some of the techniques, principles, and processes of this work. It's actually called Towards an Archaeology of the Soul, if people want to look that up. It's available at verticalpool.com if people can't find it. So the question again, tell me?
The question again is, can we share? So you called the archaeology of the soul an excavation process for making the unconscious conscious, which of course
Yeah.
most people listening are going to have some familiarity with the terms and some familiarity with Jung and his ideas about making the unconscious conscious as being one of the primary goals of someone doing this type of exploration or the function of this type of work. So I just was curious about some real life examples.
Well, the central technique of Paratheatre, as we are working at, is something called no form. And no form is a term borrowed from Buddhist Zazen meditation. It refers to a principle of profound receptivity, and whatever process can cultivate a profound internal receptivity is moving towards some state of consciousness that is on intimate terms with the void, cultivating intimacy with void, cultivating an intimacy with the experience of being nothing, or into the potential state. And in this medium, we approach that in a standing position of vertical rest. And it's a particular way of standing where it almost feels like you could fall asleep when you're standing, but you don't. It's a way of standing with using minimal tension or resistance. And that sets up the physical mechanics for the internal process of no form of cultivating internal receptivity. And what we're doing in the no form stance is cultivating internal receptivity to currents of energy, impulses, forces, autonomous forces, meaning forces that have a life of their own in the body itself. And so to actually engage in the process of making the unconscious conscious, there has to be established some kind of a intimacy with the void first. And this is something that's not going to be very common because we live in, for the most part, a void ignorant culture. People are not rewarded socially for being a nobody. We're not encouraged to develop intimacy with void. But those of us who have, bypassed the social norms a bit and are experimenting with interacting with the void space, with the zero, might be able to understand a little bit what I'm talking about. So in the process of no form, standing there, and this is also after we've undergone a very intensive hour physical warm-up. So all the bodies are just vibrating with energy at this point. And then we enter the no-form process when the bodies are warm and sweaty and vibrating. And so it's very, very simple now at this point, if you're receptive enough to begin detecting currents and energies in the body. And the process that we use there is really one of observing the expression of these forces innate to the body in the movement processes that follow. In other words, we're not really about trying to control or direct the energies that we become receptive to, but rather we create more space for those energies to come forth and to fill our emptiness and to begin moving us, bending us, breaking us, directing us in this way. So in this direction, in a sense, the energy of the body becomes the boss. We're not the boss. The body is the boss here. And so it requires a certain humility, a certain receptivity of the ego, a certain relaxation of the social persona, so that you can at least be open to the possibility of serving the expression of these energies in the body. And then more so the stepping, out into the next, realm of that process is really one of, surrender to the energies released from the body, of giving your whole physical body over to the expression of the forces that it's unleashing. And so we enter into states of surrender to the forces innate to the body. And this is the very beginning stage of the work, the process of coming into a full-bodied surrender to the expression of autonomous forces in the body itself. And through that process, basically whatever is percolating on the threshold of our consciousness, like just below our conscious ego, and that will come up. Whatever is down there, whether we like it or not, it comes up and out. And so in order to do this work and continue doing this work, people usually have to cultivate a pretty consistent level of self-acceptance and compassion towards oneself, because it's unpredictable what it is that's going to come up and through you. And if you're still working on a lot of self-criticism or self-judgment, or you're still, kind of bashing the body in your mind, or have some, bad self-image problem or whatever, the work will simply frustrate you. And so to do this work, essentially, it's necessary to build a foundation of self-support through a certain willingness to basically accept and to work with whatever comes up, regardless of its nature or form.
Right. It almost seems that you could use, the 8-circuit model again as a way to build those, to integrate those lower 4 circuits as a way to prepare yourself for what you're describing as some of the paratheatre work. Self-surrender being a fascinating component of that work.
It's very interesting what you mentioned here, because in the by the way, we do this process over 7 to 9 weeks at a time, and when we do them, I don't ever bring in the 8-circuit model into those processes, primarily because it takes a certain amount of time just to get past depending on concepts and symbols to have an experience. And part of the overall aim of the paratheatre work is really one of restoring the capacity for a more direct experience, which is to say post-symbolic or pre-conceptual. However, what I found very interesting, for example, in the online course I teach, and also, in the heart of my new book, The 8-Circuit Brain, I include paratheatre exercises and rituals as a means to begin engaging some of the qualities and energies and characteristics of all 8 circuits.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And now, as we've been discussing it, I see again how the 8 circuits relate to. Well, of course, they would relate to anything you'd experience if you look at it in the through that model. But of course, the paratheatre in particular seems to require a suspension of judgment and interpretation of what's going on. So a suspension of judgment and interpretation while you allow those forces to occur, which incidentally seems to require first a strengthening of the ego, a strengthening of the sense of self in order for there to be a self to surrender, rather than defending something that you're not sure whether or not it's there.
It's really true. And one of the ways I come to know or define a strong ego is really a flexible ego. And so a large part of the Paratheatre work is about developing more flexibility at the level of the physical, emotional, conceptual, and social egos. And as the ego gains more flexibility, it becomes stronger by virtue of being able to allow more experience, being able to allow more novelty and and the risk and the adventure of opening up to higher circuit or higher level consciousness experiences, which without the preparation of developing more flexibility can be for many can be quite frightening.
Well, right, and the more rigid the body, ultimately, in my experience, the more rigid the mind, and the more conflicted the mind. And then, just as with a piece of lumber or a support plank, the more rigid that piece of lumber is, the more likely it is to break under pressure, especially under pressure from angles that it's not meant to be sustaining pressure under.
That's exactly right. Flexibility is a real key to the endurance of greater sources of energy. And if you want to work with more energy to get more things done, you're going to have to somehow develop more flexibility, not just physically, but also emotional flexibility and conceptual, more flexible mindset, and also socially more flexible, so that you can learn to get along with a greater variety of people. That would be an example of increasing your social intelligence by becoming more of a flexible personality.
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the hallmarks that stood out to me about Gurdjieff's work, was that there was always a way for different interactions to empower all the people doing the interaction, or that were a part of the interactions, rather than rejecting someone, or ultimately, like what we do unconsciously, rejecting whole types or whole groups of people based on, you wouldn't even be conscious that you're doing it unless you started to bring that into awareness, and then develop the flexibility to know where those people might fit in your own process, or where you might fit into theirs, for an example.
Well, one thing comes to mind. Everything I've been speaking so far has really been the result of decades of work in this medium. I originally got into Paratheatre back in 1977 with none of this in mind, because I didn't know what it was or anything. I up until that time, I had been working as a performer in theater for about 10 years, and I was a pothead and an acid head, and I loved getting high. And then I started in on this Paratheatre work, and I realized that I couldn't do both. I couldn't keep taking acid or smoking pot and do Paratheatre at the same time. It just somehow messed with my head too much. And so I stopped all psychoactive drugs back in 1977 and just dedicated myself to this Paratheatre medium. And what I discovered, it got me high, that there were states of consciousness and experiences of like somatic rapture and high levels of consciousness that were coming through me in this process that mimicked very closely some of the experiences I had under psilocybin, yet without any of the kind of pesky side effects. It was just a very different kind of high, and it was over after about a few hours, and then I can go back to my daily ordinary life, and then you can return. But there was something about being able to regulate and to manage and to trigger these states myself, to give me some level of self-control or the will to power, like you mentioned before, that I found very attractive, especially as a young man, who was trying to figure out, what power was all about. And I found a certain kind of power in being able to basically conjure up and manage my own high, through the Paratheatre process. Now, since then, I found a lot of different reasons for doing the work. Getting high is still part of it, but there's maybe 5 or 6 other reasons I do it now, having been at it for so long. But that's basically why I got into it in the first place. It was like upgrading, my hedonic imperative as a young man.
That reminds me of Baudelaire. You must always be drunk.
Yeah, I could totally relate with that. Yeah,
it's a good a place as any to start, especially when what you're trying to alter in the beginning is probably that rigid sense of normality and forcing yourself to live up to that without even knowing what's going on or where that pressure is coming from. And then as you start to become aware of it,
for me,
you can, to step outside.
As a young man, it was all about, trying to escape boredom. Boredom was my enemy, and I don't have the same feeling about boredom now. Boredom is my friend now, but as a young man, I would do anything to try to escape boredom, and part of it was, doing psychoactive drugs, which totally was not boring at all. And then the Paratheatre work came along and said, wow, this is totally not boring too, and I don't have to take drugs to do it, so that's why I did it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful experiment, and I'm excited to delve more into it. I hope we get to talk some more about it even beyond this interview. But yeah, so one thing I wanted to mention in terms of that is, or one question I wanted to ask you is, do the experiences and processes that you and other participants undergo in Paratheatre affect and relate to the individual participants' daily lives and the roles they're playing therein? And by this I mean some of the seemingly mundane details of day-to-day life.
Yeah.
What happens when we make the unconscious conscious? What occurs?
Well, it certainly is going to differ for each person as each person, comes to the circle with their own, histories and upbringings and conditionings and all that. But there have been certain common reports common to the people that have done this work. One of them is that people's dream lives become more vivid or more active, or their dream recall becomes stronger, one of or both of those. So something about the dream body becomes activated in the Paratheatre work that somehow influences the dreams beyond the actual lab space. That during the course of the week when you're not doing the work, you're sleeping at night, and you're remembering your dreams more, or there's more participation in the dreams. They're not just dreams of observation, but you're actually in the world of the dream, navigating the dreams, meeting people you hadn't met before, developing relationships in the dream time. So this is one thing that's definitely been reported as a more common effect. Another would be, pretty much this is something that could happen almost with any kind of activity that opens your senses up, where the colors become more vivid, and there's a certain clarity of vision, maybe. So basically, any experience where you could describe, okay, my senses are opening up, and as a result of that, I'm perceiving more reality. I'm experiencing more impressions. My body's becoming more sensitized, and my body's more responsive. Stimuli. There's less numbness. So these are also some of the other examples of that I've heard. People talk, and also for myself, I share in these symptoms as well.
Right. That sounds really beautiful to me. I've had a lot of clients share that same experience about dreams. That have undergone some of the undoing work as well. That colors are more vivid, senses are more heightened, on a semi-permanent level too. The more people work with this kind of stuff, the more that so-called reality seems to open up. And I see a lot of crossover there in the Paratheatre work, which is what really makes it fascinating to me. One final thing that you mentioned before we say goodbye here was that You mentioned paratheater as a clear communication of internal processes, as well as the application of self-created pressures of performing actions with enough commitment to influence and transform the instrument of the self. Now, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean specifically in this context by transforming the instrument of the self? And then if you could share, a personal example or an experience that comes to mind.
Sure, sure. There are a lot of different people that come to me to work in paratheater, and I would say about half of them are performing artists of some kind, either dancers, actors, singers, musicians. And they come to me with an already built-in habit or instinct of performing, that there's this impulse to perform, oftentimes connected to the impulse to please, as in to entertain and so forth. And so they come to the paratheater work partly to relax that urge to perform, because they've found that it's gotten in the way of a more authentic expression of who they are if they're trying to entertain or please or to perform for someone else, even though that's part of the work that they do. And so there's a shift that is introduced of relaxing the urge to perform, or the pressure to perform, relaxing the pressure to perform, and replacing that with the self-created pressures of performing your commitment to the existing conditions of whatever experience you're having. And commitment here, as I'm using that word, is where I really look at commitment as a force that can be increased and regulated, where you can turn the heat up on commitment, you can increase your commitment. And when you increase your commitment to any direction, what results is a greater sense of follow-through. You're actually able to maintain and sustain a level of stamina with more commitment than with less commitment. So commitment is a pretty big deal in life, and also in this work, in the process of increasing commitment to the experience or the action at hand. And as you increase your commitment to the experience or action at hand, this will influence and transform the instrument of yourself, meaning of the doer. And this is something that people would just have to experiment on themselves, or find out, firsthand, what it is that I mean by this. But it's a very different orientation when you're performing for someone or for an audience or for a television camera or whatever, and you relax that pressure to perform and redirect it to you're still performing, but you're performing your commitment to the task at hand. So the focus is now very much on your own experience and committing to the total follow-through of that experience. And in doing so, part of the transformation that occurs results from what I call the total offering of the self. And this is part of the direction we're moving in with the paratheater work, is discovering, well, what does it mean to enter an experience of the total offering of the self? As you mentioned earlier, you have to, you need a self first before you can get past the self. But this is also a process of offering of the self, and that offering occurs through increasing the commitment to the action at hand or the particular experience before you, in a very one-pointed and even kind of fierce way. And so the level of concentration increases exponentially.
That seems to relate directly to the aspect of paratheater, and we can conclude with this particular point and let people go off into their own contemplation on this particular point, which is, again, the asocial component, which we promised to dive into just for a moment at the beginning. So I don't want to skip that. We're getting close to the end here. You described that in part as a relaxing of the social persona and allowing a temporary non-responsibility to others. Now, that seems to play an integral role in any kind of true transformation or transcendence process. So I'd love to hear just a little bit more about the asocial component and how the individuals you work with are able to achieve and or explore that asocial space, which incidentally seems to be missing in most other life experiences that are available to us.
Yeah, asocial refers to a very rare and unknown, in a sense, to many people, awareness of how to interact with other people without the usual social habits and protocols, such as seeking approval or courting someone because you find them, you think they're hot, so you want to get to know them, or seeking some kind of if it's not approval, then some kind of respect or acknowledgement. So there's a whole web of social obligations and considerations and impulses and desires that people automatically go into when they're in a room full of people. And oftentimes it's unconscious. It's not even like you're not doing it on purpose. And so asocial, the word, it refers to kind of an intermediary zone between the social on one end and all of the ways in which we know how to socialize, like at a party, and on the other extreme, the theatrical, which is based on developing characters that work on stage, that function on stage in a story based on meeting specific objectives of wanting things from the other characters. In the asocial, this third zone, kind of in between them, it's not based. The mode of interaction is not based on wanting anything from anybody. It's based on, again, going back to that no-form process of cultivating enough internal receptivity to engage sources within your own body, within your own aura, within your own system, and committing so fully to those that in the process of giving expression to those, there's a kind of an offering of presence, of movement, of gesture, of patterns of motion, that if you have a whole group of people basically doing the same thing, you have, in essence, a kind of miraculous interaction of self-governing bodies that occurs where no interaction is forced, because nothing is based on anybody wanting anything from anybody else, but it's more of this kind of process of almost of grace, of a kind of an offering of what one as an individual has been working to give expression to. And if everyone's doing that, so everyone's giving expression, and there's this mutual collective spirit of offering that occurs. So this is part of the nature of the asocial direction, and how we go there. I encourage, when I work with people, basically to not chit-chat before we get into the workspace, and to begin shifting their attention, and training of the attention plays a big role in the Paratheatre work. And the beginning process of the training of the attention is to find a way to get your attention off yourself and put it on the space around you. And that process entails, when you enter into the workspace itself, it's about 1,000 square foot dance studio kind of space, finding a way of moving through that space while relating to that space, finding a way of communicating your relationship to the space as the way you move through that space. Not the people in the space. You don't relate to the people in the space. You don't relate to the things in the space. If there's a chair or a table or a piano in the corner of the room or something, but rather developing a heightened sense of spatial awareness and relation to the space itself as a value, space as intelligence, space as sacred even. And so this begins the cultivation of an asocial climate in a group setting, is getting the attention off of oneself and onto the space itself. And what that does is it automatically begins a way of moving around other people where you're actually honoring the space around them. You're relating to the space around them first. So the space around people starts becoming honored and respected. And just by virtue of that, that becomes a very different kind of interaction to start with.
Yeah, it's an amazing jumping off point, and one that again I could see could go ignored throughout a person's entire life unless it was.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's quite rare.
Yeah, exactly. Rare, but then I think necessary to developing some of these new types of experience and awareness, and then the ability to express, what you call true creativity. To get into that truly creative space, it seems almost necessary, especially if other people are going to be involved.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to just in closing say this is that I've done this work long enough to know that paratheater is not for everybody. Mm-hmm. And it's also why I never recruit. I never, go out there trying to, muster up. People typically find me through the website or through word of mouth for people working with me. And then basically, if you're going to be, interested in actually working with me, I have to interview. We have to meet and talk to see if this is something that, is even right for you at this time. Sometimes, the timing of events is critical in terms of, okay, you may want to do this work, but, the time may not be right for you to do it now. So, yeah, I interview everybody that I that shows interest in doing this work. And, maybe, let's say, 2 out of every 5 people I interview, then I accept into the work.
That sounds about right. I think that the way you've described it now, too, on paratheatrical.com, should give people enough of a sense of what's going on there to know whether or not at least taking the step of the interview would make sense to them. I think you've described it in a really beautiful and comprehensive way there.
Yeah, I think it can benefit people who are already engaged in in their own ritual practice or in a dance or theatrical form, or in some ways performing, whether it's music or singing. Those are the people who are, I think, have found the greatest benefit of doing this work or reading about it and applying some of the principles and techniques on their own, with or without me, are the people who are already creatively engaged and artistically active. And paratheatrical.com is a good place to start. And there's also links there to not just my book, but there's a couple of video documents that have been produced on this work, so people can get a little bit more insight that way.
Yeah, very fascinating stuff, and I definitely encourage all of you listening to go take a look and watch some of those videos and click on the links and dive into it for at least a really interesting couple of hours and see if you want to go a little further with it. Then also I wanted to mention again, your 8th Circuit brain course is starting on March 15th, coming up really soon here. And folks who are listening and want to check that out can find the link directly to that just above where you're listening to or where you found this audio. And then finally, again, we'll mention your main website, verticalpool.com. And again, these will all be listed right there wherever you found or are listening to this file. So there's a lot more we could get into, obviously, but I think we got into some really cool and fascinating discussions there, and nice leaping off points for people who are listening. And I think we did a good job covering some really fascinating stuff. So I want to thank you, Antero, for coming on to do this podcast with me. Again, I'm honored to have you here and to get into some of your life's work. So thank you very much for sharing.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. You had some really good questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. So, all right, folks, we're going to leave you with that. And again, take a look at these sites and do yourself a favor and learn more about everything that we talked about, and just make sure that you keep your body involved in whatever it is that you are going to do. And I wish you all the best.